we're extremely fortunate to have with us Dr. Kevin Lynch to deliver the featured lecture. Kevin's subject is 5 Trends Changing Our World, Are We Ready? It is hard to imagine someone better equipped to present this lecture than Kevin. His academic background and impressive career positions him as one of the most credible voices on public policy issues in Canada and, in fact, internationally. For the last 5 years, Kevin has been Vice Chair of the BMO Financial Group. He is a distinguished former public servant with 33 years of service with the Government of Canada, serving as Clerk of the Privy Council, Secretary to the Cabinet, Head of the Public Service of Canada, as well as Deputy Minister of Finance, Deputy Minister of Industry, and Canada's Executive Director at the International Monetary Fund in Washington. Dr. Lynch is Chancellor of the University of King's College, Chair of the Board of Governors of the University of Waterloo, Chair of the Canadian Ditchley Foundation, Chair of the World Economic Forum's Policy Council on the Global Financial System, a Trustee of the Killam Trust, Vice Chair of the Gardner Foundation, a Board Member of the Princess Margaret Cancer Foundation, the Perimeter Institute, and the Asia Pacific Foundation. He also serves on the board of CINOC, the China National Overseas Oil Corporation, Empire, which owns Sobeys, which reminds me, Kevin, I'm really mad at Sobeys for closing a store right across the street from where I live. It was a great store. And also he's on the board of Canadian National Railways. So all that. And in his spare time, he writes op-eds for the Globe and Mail and things like that. Kevin earned his BA from Mount Allison University, his Master's in Economics from the University of Manchester, a doctorate in Economics from McMaster University, and he holds 7 honorary degrees. He was made Officer of the Order of Canada in 2011 and member of the Queen's Privy Council for Canada in 2009. He has been awarded the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal and the Queen's Golden Jubilee Medal for public service. Following Kevin's presentation, he will be joined on stage for a discussion by 3 others who bring unique expertise and insight. We're very fortunate today to have with us Ron Stiles, the CEO of SaskTel, Dr. Louise Greenberg, Deputy Minister of Advanced Education, and Harold MacKay, Senior Counsel at MacPherson Leslie Tyerman. I will introduce the panelists in more detail a bit later. Before I turn things over to Kevin to address major global trends, I recall what Doug Saunders wrote in the Globe and Mail a couple of weeks ago. He asserted the world is at a turning point. Quote, "The old rules don't seem to apply anymore. People who make a living observing the interactions between nations almost all say that some form of an even newer world order is taking shape around us, but there is little agreement as to what it looks like. From Russia," close quotes, "from Russia to the Middle East, from China to Africa and the United States to Europe, the geopolitical and economic tectonic plates are shifting. How does Canada survive and prosper in a new world that's emerging? To give shape and context to our discussion, I give you Dr. Kevin Lynch."
Well, thank you very much, Dale. Dale is, I should say, kind of a friend. He was a colleague, he's a journalist, an author, an academic, and for many, many public servants for quite a period of time, he's been a mentor. I must tell you that Dale and a lawyer I worked with a lot, Conrad von Finkenstein, have both changed my view of how you should handle strategic communications in the law. Too often in government, they were kind of dealt with at the end, and working with both Dale and Conrad, we build them into all our policy decisions at the outset. And it just gives you a sense of how important both understanding the legal basis for your decisions and actually how you might communicate something should shape it at the beginning, not the end. And Dale has been a key part of doing that. I actually want to thank you for coming out today, as long as I don't touch this thing. It's actually quite nice of you to come. I've had a career in kind of 2 of Canada's most beloved professions, bureaucracy and banking. And 3 little examples from my kind of own personal ones. One, what other model would set the title for the top public servant in Canada as the clerk? You work your way up from kind of chief to director to executive director to assistant deputy minister to clerk. And when I became the 20th clerk, there was I thought it was a rather small article in the Cape Breton Post, one of Canada's great newspapers. I come from Cape Breton. And it noted that I had been made the clerk. And I got a note from an aunt, and she said, you know, "Dear Kevin, we're all really proud about you getting this kind of new job in Ottawa. Your mother would have been very proud of you, but we're just a little worried it's going to your head because you're referring to yourself as the clerk, and everybody knows there's thousands of clerks in Ottawa." So the title doesn't quite work. The private sector doesn't get clerk at all. My other one I'll tell you is when I became Deputy Minister of Industry, which was a while back, on the form, the scroll that you get, down at the bottom it said, "and keeper of the Great Seal." And I thought, that's nice, and it can't mean anything, and so I ignored it for a period of time. And there was a lot of rumor about a new cabinet swearing in on a day, and the night before, I got a call from the Prime Minister's office saying, "There's a cabinet swearing in tomorrow, and bring the Great Seal." I thought, I didn't know there was a Great Seal. In fact, I had no idea there was anything other than this little thing at the bottom. But there is a Great Seal. I apparently was the keeper of it. And I had to find this Great Seal very quickly because my entire career was hinging on showing up. So I called somebody to find out where the Great Seal was. We had a Great Seal. It was across the river in one of our buildings in Hull. We called the person who was the assistant keeper of the Great Seal, which actually meant she kept the Great Seal. And we told her that the deputy was close to a heart attack, so it would be really nice if you could get the Great Seal over early in the morning because he had to go to Rita Hall at 9 o'clock. So anyway, 8 o'clock comes, no Great Seal and no deputy keeper of the Great Seal. 8:30, and Rita Hall is now calling, and I could see my entire career disappearing over the Great Seal. Of all the things that I thought would bring me down, the Great Seal was not one of them. Anyway, about 8:45, the lady, the deputy keeper of the Great Seal, calls from the lobby and says, "I'm here." So kind of we rushed down to kind of grab the Great Seal, and I said to her, thank you, you know, what took you so long? And she said, "Well, Mr. Lynch, I've been reading all your emails about the need for restraint, and I think it's so important to kind of follow up. I took the bus." So the Great Seal of Canada was sitting on a bus going between Hull and Ottawa. But in a strange way, that's kind of the neat thing about public servants doing. My last one for you is that if I have any lasting accomplishments from government, the strangest one is I was the first public servant to do a PowerPoint presentation to Cabinet. And it was funny, I remember going in, my minister at the time was Mr. Manley, and we were going in, and the Cabinet room in those days had no AV capacity. In fact, I'm not even sure it had plugs. So we were in a long, and so everybody thought this was a very foolhardy move to bring in the PowerPoint presentation. You had to sit a projector up at the end of the Cabinet table, and this was all going down. Mr. Manley couldn't remember my name for some strange reason as this was going on. Anyway, so we do this PowerPoint presentation. Everybody is kind of quiet, and Mr. Chrétien decides that he really liked the PowerPoint presentation. A day later, the most valuable public servants in Ottawa were people who could put together PowerPoint presentations. And there now is a job description, the federal public servant, PowerPoint presenter, actually, which exists in every department. But anyway, I digress. One other one, just before I end PowerPoints, is I was at Davos this year, and there was a panel, and 3 of the 4 people had PowerPoints and 1 didn't. And the gentleman who didn't was either mad or didn't like PowerPoints, but he had a great line, which is that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So anyway, I'm going to try and take you through 5 trends and what they mean for our world. I can go to my bottom line. Are we ready? I don't think we're anywhere close to ready in Canada. I think we should be very concerned about it. And I think it's not all public policy, and it's certainly not all government issues, but government has to be part of it, and public policy has to be part, and the private sector has to be part of the conversations, and they're not as much as they should be. And I think education has to be a huge part of the conversations, and they're intermittently in it. I also want to say, and this was a line that the late Jim Flaherty used to use every time that he had to read a finance presentation that Dale put together, and he used to say, quote, I want to assure the audience that the presentation is not nearly as long as it will seem. So I'll take you through it. Okay, first is the overview, if this works, which it may or may not, and it doesn't seem to. So let me try this. There we go. And what are the 5 trends changing our world? And let me kind of put them up for you. First is globalization. We've been talking about globalization for a while. But to actually go to the Tom Friedman point of view, we've actually moved now to a hyper-connected world. And it's really quite extraordinary. A good example of it is the financial crisis. I mean, the financial crisis, it was a bunch of lousy mortgages in Arizona, Florida, and California. The Americans have been producing lousy mortgages in Arizona, California, and Florida for decades. They had one in the 80s. It was called the savings and loan crisis. It was an American issue. The difference this time is those lousy mortgages were held in every single country, in every single balance sheet around the world. And nobody knew how interconnected we were through it. And that happens whether it's people, whether it's business, and what have you. Second is technology. We're in an inflection point again, and I'll take you through the Google, in a sense, world. I thought the most interesting presentations at Davos this year were by Google, and talking about not the search engine, but actually how deeply Google is into artificial intelligence and things of that sort. And it really is quite neat. At Davos as well, you can also tell who's in and who's out. Before the financial crisis, the lineups for the Morgan Stanley parties would go 3 or 4 blocks. Today, anybody in this room could get into a banking reception at Davos. But Google and Facebook, you actually have to book 6 months in advance to get in. So it's kind of even interesting to see how they change. Energy, I'll take you through. There's a revolution happening, and it's both in supply and demand, which is worth noting. Demographics, the challenge is the world is still growing. The problem is the West, us. Nobody in this room, obviously, is aging. And the last one is education. The demands are changing, but the model is not. And I think we have a problem of incongruence between kind of needs and the supply right now. So that's kind of the world we kind of face. What it really is happening is change. The thing I actually would really focus on, though, is the last point, which is that I think Canadians are spending more time debating whether they like these trends, and it really doesn't matter if they like them or not. And they're not spending much time at all asking the core question, which is how well and how quickly are we adapting to them? And so in a sense, we're actually looking at seizing on the wrong issue. So those are the trends. First one is the global context is changing, and absolutely profusely. And here it's happening because of the emerging markets, and it's globalization, it's urbanization, it's technology, and all those things. And we've created a hyper-connected world. And if you go on the left-hand side, this is kind of a neat little graph. It comes from the London School of Economics, and it's a geo-mapping of the global center of economic gravity. And they go back to 1 AD, however they do it. And what you see, if you can kind of follow it around, is a 2,000-year outward journey from Western China, which was the economic center of the world in 1 AD, and for quite a period after, to the Second World War and afterwards, where it's actually mid-Atlantic. The fascinating thing is between 1975 and 2025, you're going to be exactly back to the same place that we started 2,000 years ago. And it's a 2,000-year outward journey, but going back is happening in 75 years. And my question is, how many businesses, policies, education have got their minds around that pace of change, right? I graduated in 1972, Mount Allison, and probably half the universities in Canada. You couldn't get an undergraduate degree unless you took 2 years in a second language, right? 1972. Today, my understanding is there are no universities in Canada that require a second language to get a general degree. And is the world more global today than it was in 1972? I think so. So how we're customizing ourselves to this, not so clear. On the right-hand side, give you some, if you don't like the kind of 2,000-year journey, here's some factoids. Think about the change, and if we had the same conversation even 10, 15 years back, world's richest man is Mexican today, not American. World's tallest building, it's in Dubai, not in New York City. The world's largest shopping mall, it's not in Chicago anymore, it's in Beijing. The world's largest movie industry, it's in Bollywood, not Hollywood. In fact, Africa could take over second place soon. And China adds a new New York City every single year in China. That's a pretty rapidly changing world. We worry about adding a neighborhood here. They add a New York City. Okay, so that's a little bit of it. One of the consequences of all this is a two-speed world. And we've always had a two-speed world. The difference is that we used to be in the fast lane. You know, for the 60, 70 years after the Second World War, the OECD, the West, were in the fast lane, and the emerging markets were in the slow lane. And so we didn't pay a lot of attention. What's happened in the last 10, 15 years, and it wasn't the financial crisis, it was before that, it just exacerbated and made it clear is, suddenly we flipped lanes. The West, us, we're in the slow lane. And it's actually getting slower and slower. And the emerging markets are in the fast lane. And if you look at the numbers on the left, if you can see them, you can see the advanced economies, that's a polite way of saying the West, they're growing at 1 to 2%. Europe, under 1%, and it'll never grow above 1% again. In total, close to 2 because of the United States, Canada, and Australia. But if you look up to the emerging markets, it's double to triple that. And if you look at emerging Asia, it's 7%. And it has been for the last 15 years, and it will be as far into the future. And figure, if you want to grow, so if the objective in the province is to grow the province, if the objective is to grow Canada, if you're a company, if you're trying to grow and you're actually doing your business in a market that's not growing much, that's really tough. If you're growing in a rapidly growing market, it's a lot easier. And so in many ways, our business model, which was to attach ourselves to the United States because it was the fastest growing market in the world for 70, 80 years, that actually modeled, the logic is still right, but actually who we're attaching ourselves to for growth, not clearly as right. And graphically, you can see it on the right. At the bottom is the Eurozone. You couldn't have a worse business partner now than the Eurozone in terms of growth. And it's not cyclical, it's structural. Work your way up, the advanced economies in yellow, then the US, then the world, and then you go emerging, and then you go to emerging Asia. And the issue for us is, and it's true whether it's universities, whether it's business, whether it's government, is when are we going to pivot to that? Gretzky, who's one of the great experts on trade diversification, has a lovely line, which is you want to skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it's been. You know, where it's been is where we trade. Where it's going to be is actually where we don't trade. 90% of Canada's trade is with the OECD countries, 10% with emerging markets. Not quite the right balance. And so the next one is that diversification is both a necessity, I think it's an imperative, it's also good for business. So two little graphs here. One on the left, think about how Canadians view themselves. We always think that we're more open, we're more worldly, we're more global than our neighbors to the south. We're not. If you look, we have the least penetration in terms of trade to emerging markets. The United States is higher than us. Bank of Canada has done a study that if we just had the same degree of penetration to emerging markets as the United States, our GDP and our exports would be $60 billion a year higher forever. It's pretty hard to think of a government policy that will give you an annuity of $60 billion. A little tax fiddling won't do it. A few little spending programs here and there won't do it. Subsidy program won't do it. Trade, pivoting on a massive way, can. And so if you say, okay, I get the concept, but where in the world are we going to do it? What do we produce that's going to go on that? And this graph on the right-hand side comes from McKinsey. McKinsey argues that Canada's looking at the wrong thing. It's looking at those markets over there and saying, how in the world do I compete with Samsung or the other tech? And frankly, we're not going to. What McKinsey argues Canada should be doing is focusing on the new middle class. There are now 1 billion middle-class Asians. There were almost no middle-class Asians 15 years back. That's a bigger middle class than North America and Europe combined. And what are we pretty good at doing in Canada? At producing services, which is what middle class, whether it's education, whether it's health, whether it's financial services, whether it's tourism, healthcare, and agricultural foods. What's the first thing you do when you move up the income rankings? Is you buy better food for your family. You buy better housing, that's called timber. You buy better education, we're pretty good at that. And so many ways the potential for Canada in the emerging world isn't selling physical goods, it's actually selling services and agricultural products. And we should think through it a little bit more. And energy. Energy is clear, but energy is the one that we both think of but don't think past. What I'm arguing is there's a fair bit of thinking past. Now, a couple of the challenges. One, China is the only emerging market that we trade with that's more than 1% of our exports, and China is only 3.5%, right? Challenge there. And how about the U.S. side? I had the StatsCan run some numbers, which is Canadian exports, our share of American imports. In other words, our share of American trade. How big are we in the American calculus? If you go back to 2000, we were 18.5% of all American imports. That's pretty big. We were almost a fifth of the entire American import basket. By 2007, so this is before the financial crisis, this is before the recession, that had fallen to 15%. Today it's 12.5%. It's going to go down further. And so if we don't shift to Asia, the market that we actually are most invested in is already shifting away from us. And so this isn't a choice for us. Our choice is whether we diversify. Our key market is already diversifying away from us. And the difference is huge. If you go the absolute level of Canadian exports in 2000, this is excluding energy, to today, it's $65 billion a year lower. So that's the cost of non-diversification. The other one that's worth looking at in Saskatchewan, I think, is who trades. Small and medium-sized enterprises in Canada is a small and medium-sized enterprise economy. Only 10% of Canadian SMEs did a single trade across an international border last year, and in Saskatchewan it was 3.9%, the second lowest in the country. And so if we don't get our small and medium-sized enterprises trading, we're not going to trade. We don't have enough big companies to do it. We are that. We've been very successful in some domains. That's one we have to do. So that's the trade trend. The second is technology, and I'm arguing here that it's at an inflection point again. And what's happening in technology? It's big data, it's big analytics, it's huge computing power, and it's adaptive learning. I don't know how many have watched the YouTube of the two Jeopardy champs playing against Watson. Anyone seen it? They lose. Watson wins. And Eric Schmidt of Google argues that that was a pivot point, because it's pretty simple to teach a computer to play chess. It's a series of rules and algorithms. But it's incredibly complicated to teach a computer adaptive learning to figure out how to think through the Jeopardy questions and what it means. And where we're going in this one is, if you look, is at the top, these are the disruptor technologies. Right? These are the ones that are going to change the way you do business. Mobile internet, automation, Internet of Things, cloud, robotics, and what have you. Interesting thing, just on the adaptive learning, Eric Schmidt even pointed out that there are three professions that are most at risk of being disintermediated. One is lawyers, one is accountants, and the worst one is economists, unfortunately. But it goes to what can happen now. And so the next phase of this, and it's a public policy issue, it's a private sector issue, it's an education issue. So what happened in the first phase of technological change? We moved a lot of lower skilled jobs overseas, and or we automated them. What Schmidt is arguing for the next phase is we're going to actually start to disintermediate high skilled jobs, ones that we never thought that you actually could computerize before. And so I think the questions, there's three for us. If you take the paradigm, the questions are, do we want to be disrupted or do we want to be disruptors? You know, we're not going to get a choice on whether the thing happens. The issue for us is, do we want to move ahead of the curve or do we actually want to wait for the curve to hit us? Subsidiary one is, do you want to be an early adopter or late follower? All the economics says early adopters. You don't necessarily want to be the inventor, but you want to be an early adopter. And the last one is, do we want to be ambitious or complacent? And I think you can make a pretty good case that complacency is a big risk. So that's actually where we're looking at in the technology side. What that takes you to then is think about the competitiveness paradigm. What's it take to be competitive today? If you're a business person, if you're thinking of doing public policy and worrying about kind of competitiveness, how is a Canadian firm competitive against a firm in China or South Korea or Vietnam today? Because they can produce a standardized good at an enormous scale, at extremely low cost, and at a price that we can't match. So how do we compete with them? And the answer is we don't. We shouldn't. We can't. What we have to do is look at competitiveness paradigm that's around, which is you want to basically be innovative. You want to have a highly non-standardized good or service. You want to produce it in innovative ways, and you want to market it, deliver it to markets in different ways. In other words, you have to move faster than actually countries and societies that have the capacity to turn it into a standardized good can actually lower the cost curve. And that means that you can't do something once off. You've got to continually be on that innovation. So the World Economic Forum talks about countries like Canada, which are high standard of living, high cost, have to have an innovation engine to drive their competitiveness. And that's not how we thought about public policy 10, 15, 20 years back. You know, we worried more about EI programs than we worried about how we help create innovation engines in companies. So if you take that kind of view of how important it is, the left-hand side gives you a sense of how Canada is doing on one measure of innovation, which is R&D spending. We're 22nd. We're after those powerhouses of Luxembourg, Ireland, Belgium, Estonia, Ireland, Slovenia, Slovakia, and what have you. We're pathetic. We're almost at the bottom of the OECD ranking. So here's one of the richest, best educated countries in the world, and our spending on R&D and innovation, which everybody accepts is going to be a key driver of future competitiveness, is amongst the worst in the world. I'll show you when we get to the last slide, but the World Economic Forum just came out with its global competitiveness rankings. Canada slipped from 14th to 15th. And you think, well, in fact, why are we only 14th? You know, we have some of the lowest net debt in the world. We have the best, soundest banking system in the world. We have the highest rate of tertiary post-secondary education. Do you know the thing that actually pulls us down? We rank 26 in innovation, amongst the worst in the world. And so, did we get worse? Not necessarily. Everybody else got better. We got complacent. And the other thing that's interesting is the World Economic Forum weights innovation more and more and more as they take the paradigm on. So 20 years back, being not great on innovation didn't cost you a lot in a competitiveness ranking. Today, being not good on innovation costs you hugely. So it has real consequences. How about Saskatchewan? On the right-hand side, not good. You're down towards the bottom. And think of Canada. Our main competitor today is the United States. We spend, and this is private sector, this is not government. Government actually does a good job on this. This is the private sector. We spend half as much in the private sector per capita on R&D as the United States. And Saskatchewan is kind of 1/4 of the national average. So again, it comes right down to company by company, region by region. If you believe competitiveness is going to be driven by innovation, we've got a bit of a challenge. So how do you do it? One is ecosystems for innovation, and it's really important to think about this in two ways. One is startups. How many here would your first choice coming out of university be join an established firm like SaskTel or a law firm like Harrell's, or would it be go with a startup? How many here would choose a startup? Great.
I did.
Fantastic. And you, unfortunately, are our exception, and that's our challenge. We gave an honorary doctorate to the president of Technion University, which is in Israel. If you've read the book Startup Nation, it's based around Technion. And so he came and he was talking, but one of the most extraordinary statistics he had for Technion, which is an engineering school about the size of University of Saskatchewan in size, is that the graduating class, 43% of the graduating class, their first job is in a startup, and it's their preferred first job. And when we ran the numbers across Canada, we couldn't find a single university where the graduating class numbers taking a job in a startup was above 5%. And so part of this challenge is we want to have an innovation-laden. The most innovative firms are startups. By definition, they are an innovation. They didn't exist before. They actually have the DNA of kind of entrepreneurship. So you have a challenge there. If you look at the standard ecosystems for success, and we should ask ourselves, how are you doing here? Part of this is public policy, part of it is private sector behavior, part of it is what we teach. First is market opportunities. Is there a demand for new innovative products? If nobody will buy them locally, if people are so cheap that they just want the lowest cost standardized good, then you're not going to be successful because there's no market demand for your products, right? So first is there market demand? Second is, how about competitive intensity? If you've got a monopoly, why change? you're not going to change. All the statistics say it. So if you look at Boston, Silicon Valley, everywhere where there's been success, there's enormous competition. Not necessarily foreign competition, it's actually the person sitting at the desk next to you is competing like heck for a better product than you. And it matters. Is there a cluster of skills? You know, do you have that ability to find the skill set around it? It'll help you. It's pretty lonely being an entrepreneur with a startup coming out of school. How about the structure of the sector? Is it knowledge intensive? Are public policies supportive? That's usually an incubator and other stuff. And is the corporate culture entrepreneurial? And nobody would accuse the business culture in Canada of being excessively entrepreneurial at the moment. I was down at Harvard 2-3 weeks back, and the dean invited me down for a lunch with their guru on entrepreneurship and innovation, and really two quite extraordinary kind of profs. But on the innovation was interesting. He knew Canada. He wouldn't rank Canada really high on innovation or entrepreneurship. But his argument is that entrepreneurship can be taught and it can be untaught. And he thinks most education systems teach entrepreneurship out of you rather than actually encourage it in you. And he pushes very strongly that co-op programs, mentorship, all sorts of things of that sort, we've got to build into our education systems to kind of spur all that. So that's the EGOT. My personal view is, I love the quote that research is turning money into knowledge and innovation is turning knowledge back into money. And Canada has to do both, because that's the virtuous circle. You know, governments today, taxpayers, you or you in the future, we're very supportive. The government of Saskatchewan is great in terms of supporting kind of research in our universities here and across the country. But it's got to be a virtuous circle. We've got to turn that research into jobs and growth and wealth and tax base as well. And that's where the innovation comes in as well. So that's two. Number three is we're in the midst of an energy revolution. And it really is. And I think people are made, and I describe it as an unconventional energy revolution in two ways. First is the supply of energy is not coming because we found new fields. It's coming because we found new technology to apply to old fields. Shale gas, people found the shale gas field 60 years back. They just couldn't figure out how to get the shale gas out until the last 7 or 8 years. Who actually figured out shale gas? Was it Exxon? No, it wasn't. It was an entrepreneur, small business person who persevered and actually turned tinkering into probably the biggest technological change that the energy sector has seen in North America in 40-odd years. So if you look at my left-hand side, which is an equation, and my only one in the presentation, it kind of goes through the revolution. At the top, the change in demand. And there is a revolution in demand. And what it is demand's going to grow just as much for hydrocarbons in the next 20 years as it did in the last. The change is 97% of the increase in demand for hydrocarbons is going to come from emerging markets, and 3% from the OECD. And if you go back 20 years, it was completely the reverse. And so where the demand is not where the demand was. And think about that in Canada's case, is the U.S. is in net energy self-sufficiency. It actually doesn't need any more energy. And yet our advantage is we have the capacity to supply more. And so we have, strangely enough, as the shale revolution and the oil revolution in the States have actually reduced American insecurity of energy supply, they've increased Canadian insecurity of energy demand. And if we don't diversify, we don't find new markets, we're actually going to be in a declining market situation. And you can sort of see that through the page. So our conundrum on the right-hand side is U.S. hydrocarbon supply is going up and U.S. demand is actually going down first. Not good for us because they're our only market. 100% of Canadian oil, 100% of Canadian gas goes to the United States today, right? So that's a U.S. market. That's our monopoly buyer. Second is, we actually can produce a lot more oil and gas. So we have enormous capacity to produce more, but our only market is actually buying less. Not a good situation. And it equals at the bottom a declining Canadian energy security. And so the question, you know, governments put it out quite often, the issue is, can Canada be an energy superpower? And the issue is maybe, but not unless we change, not in the status quo. Because we can't supply any of that potential oil and gas to anybody because we don't ship to Asia and we don't ship to Europe. And so where all the extra markets are, we're not there. And part of the challenge is, there's a lot of talk about social license or chat about what. My view is that the better way to think about this in a public policy and in almost an arbitration sense is that we've got a multiple licensing imperative. And unless we get all 4 licenses lined up, and not anybody with a veto, but all actually have to be heard and have to feel that they are part of it in their commercial license, doesn't matter if it doesn't make economic sense, the companies aren't going to do it. So there is a limit to how much you can reduce the rate of return. So that's a commercial license. But just because it makes economic sense doesn't mean we can or should do it, right? So that's the second is policy license. We have regulations for reasons, and therefore they have to be met. So there's the policy license. Social license is if projects impact on either communities or environmental concerns or Aboriginal kind of rights, then essentially you need to achieve social license, and part of that is just public dialogue. And last is an innovation license. Strangely enough, innovation makes a big difference in kind of doing all this. So my sense is, I think we can be an energy player, but if we don't have the ability to ship gas and oil to Asia, if we don't have the ability to ship gas and oil to Europe, where in the world are we going to sell it? And if we can't sell it, then capital markets aren't going to give us money to produce more. And suddenly, all the resource rents that have fueled so much, not just of the West, but of Canada, will actually start to slow down. So, trend 4 is demographics. And the question I raise is, how old exactly are we? And that gives you a little bit of a sense. If you want to feel good, Canada is less old than Europe and Japan. But we're actually older than the United States, and we're older than Mexico, and we're older than the rest of the world. And we're aging pretty fast. And if you look at the top graph, kind of interesting, it says by 2030, we're going to be in a position in Canada where there will be absolutely no net population growth from actually foreign, from Canadian citizens, people living in Canada. We'll be at a net zero. So the only sources of population growth will be immigration at that point in time. And if you look at the bottom one, it's kind of neat. It shows the foreign-born populations by region. You see the 2 highest by far are BC and Ontario. Alberta is climbing up. Fascinating statistic from Stats Canada is by 2017, more than 50% of the population of Toronto will be foreign-born. And so this is a tremendous asset to Canada. It's a tremendous change. But part of our public policy and other things is to make sure that we're able to integrate and absorb all that. Demographics affect simply everything. Let me just show you 2 little graphs on the left. What's happening in Canada is that we have more and more Canadians, but they're not of working age. And so what's happening is the number of people that work for a given population is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So therefore the tax base that supports everything we do is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. If you're part of that tax base and you're young, that's really not good for you because taxes are only going to go in one direction on you. And you can see on the right-hand side what David Foote says basically demographics affects everything, and it's true. If you've got a young, growing population, all sorts of good things happen in terms of growth. But if you've got an aging population, different things happen. Canada has a growth problem. Our potential growth rate today has been about 2 3/4 to 3% for 50, 60 years. It's heading towards 2%. And it's going down for 2 reasons: aging and productivity growth, which we're doing poor at. And unless we change those 2 structurally, we're heading into the world on the top right, which is lower growth, more pressure on fiscal balance. Think about it. We need fewer educators in that world. Think about the political swing. Suddenly, an older, basically people, citizens vote their own interest. Their interest is going to be more health care than it's actually going to be education. You start to move where the median age of the population no longer has kids at home and actually moves past it, your voting preferences change. And so as we age, we're going to have to think through a lot of these. It'll affect the private sector. It'll affect the public sector. Last trend, quickly, is education. In a strange way, it's kind of at the epicenter of 3 of these. Demographics, nothing's going to affect education more than demographics. And in Canada, the funny thing is actually, even for given demographics, they're not going to the same places uniformly. Our demographic, I come from the Maritimes, it has the worst demographics in the country, almost no immigration, and a lot of out-migration and a lot of aging. Toronto, Alberta, BC, the three main recipients. And so one of our issues is, how do we up immigration, but actually how do we spread immigration more evenly, because everybody has the demographic aging kind of problem in Canada. The challenges in education, though, on the left shows you, the lines at the bottom, show that the number of Canadians 15 to 29 is going down. That's really bad if you're a K-12 system manager, and it's going to be bad in X years if you're a university administrator, and it's going to be really bad in X years plus if you're a business person, because you're not going to have the skilled worker to hire. So we're all involved in this. This isn't just an education issue. It isn't just a government issue. It's a Canadian issue. If you look in the middle one, this is the globalization of education. And we're starting to see it happen. Canada, again, is way behind globalization. If you look in the graph, you can see I picked 4 countries. The United States, 18% of the international student market the United States gets. Probably not a surprise for the United States. How about Australia? Australia is 2/3 the size of Canada. It gets 13% of the international student market. That's 557,000 foreign students a year. Canada is less than half that, with a larger university base, with a larger population, in many ways with more connections. Australia today, the 3rd largest export for Australia is education. Number 1, energy. Number 2, minerals. Number 3, education. Think of it. So this is not just something that's nice to do. This actually is the right thing to do, because you want to have an international experience for Canadian kids kind of learning, because that's the world. But it's extraordinarily big business for a country if you have a strategy. And we really don't have a strategy here. Last one is the rise of MOOCs, massively online kind of courses. And again, this is the transformative technology. Nobody has a clue where this stuff will end up, but everybody agrees it's going to transform pretty dramatically what we do now. And I'll talk through a few little models kind of after. So those are the changes happening. The fourth is hitting higher education. This is more higher education. I actually go through 5 for you. One is revenues from traditional sources are falling. Governments aren't going to be able to put in as much per capita as they have in the past. You'd like it, but it's not the reality. It's just not the fiscal reality of Canada. So what do? How do you handle that, right? Interesting issue. Second is demands for higher returns from education are rising. Kids actually don't want to come out of a BA and not be able to get a job. They really, or not be able to get a good job. They really would like have a decent thing. So are we skill equipping graduates in our universities across the country for the workforce? The data is suggesting no. It's very mixed. We have some universities, and the data is actually getting better, where we've got 95 to 100% employment rates at reasonable starting wages. We've got other universities in Canada where it's much less. And so we have a gap. It's the same cost, it's the same number of years, but it's not producing the same outcomes. Third is governments are in this game too, and they're saying, wait a minute, we'd actually like to know a little bit more about how this stuff is working. How's the K-12 system doing? This is the PISA results for the OECD. How about the universities? We have the Differentiation Higher Education Commission in Ontario, and it's trying to get comparative data so kids compare one university to another. It's not easy getting that data, frankly, and it's not because the kids don't want it, it's the universities are a little slow to produce it. The fourth one is the new business model. Personally, I don't think MOOCs as standalone models are going to take over the world. Where I think the model is going to go is actually what's called the internal MOOC, that universities are going to put themselves online inside the walls of the university, and MIT is looking at that today. So they internalize it. So you can be here for this kind of lecture. You could actually look at it again and again. You could stream it anywhere you are on campus endlessly. In fact, the whole thing would be done kind of that way, and the lecture would turn into an interactive discussion with the professor. The data dump, if you will, is done online. And MIT is probably ahead of anybody in looking at that. We went into globalization of education. We're way behind in Canada. Why in the heck are we behind? We've got almost the highest proportion of foreign-born population anywhere. You know, we are extraordinarily welcoming of every culture. A great line that someone had at the United Nations is that no person in the world can look to Canada and not see him or herself, which is true. But why in the world are we not turning it around and actually showing that same advantage in education? How are we getting beaten by Australia, the UK? Interesting one. And the last one is, and I think this is really important in a public policy sense, all the studies show an enormous correlation between income inequality, but more income mobility and education. Come out of education, you know, come out of K to 12 with poor skills, and if you go back to that technologically changing world, you're actually in really big trouble. And the remediation costs, societal, everything else, are really high. Getting it done right the first time is really important in the model. So, wrap up quickly. What's it all mean? I was going to bring it for a couple of things. What's it all mean for managing, right? And I think here it affects trust. And trust, I don't think we talk about as much as we should. I think trust is a soft infrastructure of governing. Whether you're governing a company, whether you're governing a university, whether you're governing a province or a country. And if you don't have, in times of change, people get cautious and nervous. If you're promoting change and they have very low trust levels in you, do you think people are going to follow you? Not a chance. If it's a big change, but you actually have a lot of trust, then you can move a fair bit. On the left-hand side, this is the Edelman surveys. They do trust surveys for both sectors and for for governments. In 26 countries, they've been doing it for 12 years. That gives you the sectoral ratings for Canada. The gold standard for trust for business sectors, technology. It used to be banks. It isn't anymore. Government is down there at 51%, which is not great. But do you know what government is in the United States? It's 39%. Business in Canada is 62%. Do you know what business is in the land of free enterprise? 48. So strangely enough, we actually trust governments more in Canada than the Americans. Maybe or maybe not a surprise, but we actually trust business more than Americans. We trust NGOs more than Americans, and we trust the press about the same. So that's our model in Canada. They also ask, who do you trust? So if SaskTel is trying to kind of convince people to change, or if a government is trying to convince people to change, or I'm the head of a company, I'm trying to convince you to change your product, who is it? Well, down at the bottom, you can see it's not one of the board of directors, Harold. They're at 35%. It's not the CEO. He or she is even below that. It's actually up at the top. Academics. There is a role for analytic-based. The average Canadian trusts people who bring evidence-based research to bear. They trust technical experts. It's not surprising. Look at a Ford Motor Company commercial. Who do they put on the screen talking about a new model? It's a Ford Motor technician who kind of flubs their lines because they're a Ford Motor technician. That's actually not just because they happen to like Harry or Louise that they put on screen. It's because all this research says that people trust what they're saying a lot more than if they actually put the CEO of Ford Motor Company on the screen. So again, as we're thinking about managing these huge tectonic forces of change, don't forget the importance of trust in all this. Next one is, what's it mean for risk management? And if you're in government, one of the things you'll be drilled into you is risk management. If you're in a bank, you're drilled into it all the time. If you're almost anywhere, it's into you all the time. There's been as big a change in risk management because of these changes. And let me give you an example. March last year, a small bank in Cyprus went bankrupt. What happened? The New York Stock Exchange fell 5%. The 5% fall in the New York Stock Exchange was not only bigger than the entire market cap of that bank, it was more than the market cap of Cyprus itself. Why? Because of uncertainty. Nobody had a clue who held the now valueless assets of that small Cyprus bank. In other words, it's such an interconnected world. Uncertainty, knowledge, certainty about interconnectedness, but lack of certainty about what the interconnections were led to that. And so the message that comes out from this is the three big changes are we're in an interconnected world. There's much more volatility and uncertainty, but mostly important, local events can have systemic impacts. And that didn't used to be the case. The lousy mortgages in the States, that's been happening decade after decade since the U.S. has been a country with a banking system. The difference is a local event can now have systemic impacts. So if you look at this list, the World Economic Forum, and I'm on their panel that does these, they ask each year, we've got a panel of about 2,300 business leaders from around the world, and they ask them what the top 10 global risks are. And that's the left-hand side. This was before Ebola. But if you look at the list, it catches pretty well everything we're worried about today. And the neat thing about these is how interconnected they are, right? So structural unemployment in Spain is viewed as a social issue as much as it's viewed as an economic issue. Think about it. The youth unemployment rate in Spain today is about 53%. How would you explain to your kids, go to school and you'll have less than a 50-50 chance of finding a job after school? How do you maintain kind of social stability when you get those? So the risks are, and then if you had that problem in Spain, what happens across the Eurozone? And if something happens across the Eurozone, what happens to markets in Canada? And then what happens to migration patterns? What happens if 4 more Ebola patients show up in the United States and suddenly transportation links start to get cut off because of public fear? It'll have huge interconnected consequences. So again, as you think about either public policy, whether you're planning in the private sector, education, things, again, is the nature of the interconnected risks are fundamentally different. The last one is what's it mean for governing? And let me give you a couple little kind of lists here that I think are interesting. And this doesn't matter whether it's corporate governing or whether it's political governing. The first is globalization and sovereignty. If you believe my kind of, or take to heart my pitch today, what it says is that business, finance, people, mass culture, education, you know it, actually it's completely global. It knows no borders whatsoever. But borders know national sovereignty. And so our model of governing is still very stubbornly national, but our model of doing business is totally global. The last time we built an international economic agency was the WTO, which was the GATS in the early 50s. The IMF set up in 1944 to avoid doing the 1930s again. The World Bank was set up in 1944 to avoid the ills of the past. The United Nations was set up in 1945. The world is so fundamentally more globalized today than it was then, and yet we haven't added a single new institution, formal institution of global governance. Interesting kind of issue that I think Canadians should worry about. I think it's an area where Canada could play a role. Second is, and Dale knows this so much better than I do, but communications, policy, and vision. Think about the challenge. In a Google world, information is ubiquitous, right? But knowledge isn't, and analysis isn't. And so you can go on and tap on any question you want, and up will come 43 opinions. When we were doing the vaccination for the H1N1, and so we had a very tough, Dale, you were in PCO at the time, we had a really, really kind of tough schedule for rolling out the vaccinations across the country. So we had it, and it was high-risk people first, elderly, pregnant women, young kids with respiratory difficulties and others. And so we had a plan for so many the first week, so many the second week, what have you. So at the end of the first week, we were so far behind our targets, it was unbelievable. Was it because we couldn't find enough nurses and caregivers to give the injections? No. Couldn't set up the sites? They were beautifully set up. Every province did its job. Every municipality did its job beautifully. Do you know what stopped us dead? Google. Because everybody who was coming in Monday to get their vaccination Googled H1N1, and on the internet, there are 23 opinions for any single question you put in. And so people were coming in with 30 and 40 pages of paper to actually want to discuss what the implications were, as was their right. Is it their mistake? No, it was ours. Because we didn't think, how do you do this in a Google world? You have to push the information out. You have to anticipate that they will actually type in Google, and you actually have to respond before they come. So for us, it was an interesting example of learning how to do policy in that world. Technology and governing, I think as challenging as innovation is in the private sector, I don't think we've even started to bring innovation into the public service. How much differently could we do interactions with the public, service delivery, using technology, using kind of leading edge stuff. We're really behind. Age preferences, I mentioned that before. I tell you, 60-year-olds vote for very different baskets of political preferences than 40-year-olds, regardless of the party that they are assigned to, and that's the world. Crisis in public trust. The more crises you have, the more public trust goes down. Interesting enough, even though Canada, and we avoided the financial crisis, we didn't have the mortgage crisis, all that sort of stuff, even though we have much more public trust than the United States, if you ask Canadians, what's the role of government? Number one issue that comes up is to protect the public against business doing harm. And if you then go and poll, but what harm, the examples are almost none of them are Canadian. They're BP in the Gulf of Mexico, they're Enron, they're the financial crisis in the United States and the other stuff. But again, in an interconnected world, you know, your fear is my fear. And it affects our trust levels and we have to deal with it. And the last one in a Westminster system, which I think is really important for folks here to think about, is that we run a system that has checks and balances. And how well do those checks and balances work in this world? It was designed for a very different world than Google, Twitter, you name it. And how are we handling that? Centralization? Centralization isn't happening because one government wants to centralize. Centralization happens because technology allows you to centralize. And so what do we do about those inherent forces? A lot of the changes that you see and some of the behaviors you like or don't like are actually coming because of exactly the same forces. And so, but that's not making them right or wrong. It's saying if we want to manage them, we're going to have to accept what the source is and figure out how we manage them. So my last, if I can, for you is, what does all this mean, these 5 tectonic trends for kind of our economic, but maybe even important, our social success in Canada? And I guess, most importantly, I think the paradigm is changing. You know, we can't be successful by trying to do what we did in the past. We did that very successfully. In the future, what we've got to do is we've got to be a much more innovative, entrepreneurial, all those sort of things that play to our strengths, which is high education, kind of high public infrastructure, high standards of living. So I pulled out 10 of the standard global benchmarks for these sorts of things, right? And I picked out the top 5 countries, and I picked out Canada, and of course, since we're Canadian, you have to put the United States up as well, actually, so we see how well we're doing. And these aren't meant to be right or wrong, but this is the basket. So see where Canada comes. First one, the Global Competitiveness Index, we're not in the top 5. If you look at the second one, innovation capacity, we're 27. We're not in the top 5. Productivity, we're number 17. We're not in the top 5. Soundness of financial systems, we're number 1. Pretty good. Net debt, we're 12. We're not as good as we think. We're great compared to the United States, which is just horrible, and Europe, but we're not as great as we think. Tertiary education, we're number 1. But actually, that's my generation. That's not the next generation. That's a proportion. If you look at K to 12, we're number 13. And it's all Asian and smaller. If you look at the number of universities in the top 100, we're not pulling our weight. We are beaten by, maybe we accept the United States, but UK, Germany, Australia, number of research universities. Ranking of cities, Canada does really well. And the last one is institutional strength. Again, this is something we think we're always the top of. We're not. We do pretty well, but we're not the top. A couple of messages here, if you look at it. It's being a big country doesn't necessarily get you in the top 5 of any of these. Being a nimble country, being a country that's able to actually move ahead of the curve, be an early adapter, that actually gets you ahead. And so Sweden, Finland, countries that don't have the assets that we have, either human capital or physical, do extremely well in these surveys. And large countries can do well or not well. And where we do worse, strangely enough, is back on the innovation. If you do a Canadian kind of average of all this, what you say is, we do pretty well, right? But I think the question for Canadians is, in a hyper-connected world, with all the competitors we have and the challenges out there, is being pretty good enough for the future? I don't think it is. And so our issue is, how do we fight the complacency, essentially, of actually thinking pretty good is good enough? Thank you.
Thanks, Bill, for the a nice introduction, and to my panel members here, and to Kevin. That was a great presentation, and Kevin provided a lot of, I think, food for thought, and his comments on educational trends are highly relevant, and I agree with the trends and points made. I'd like to focus on one of his key areas, that education is at the epicenter of how economies and societies make the shift to knowledge-intensive work, or the knowledge economy. I want to quickly state a few key elements of the knowledge-based economy, and then discuss how post-secondary institutions are responding to its emergence while fulfilling their traditional roles, which is technical training at our colleges and our technical institutes, and research, teaching, and independent scholarship at our universities. I'll probably talk for about 5 or 6 or 7 minutes. Usually, when I'm at home, I practice the night before. I've got the audience of the cats and the dog, who may or may not give me the feedback that I need. So, fundamentally, in the knowledge-based economy, post-secondary education is seen both as an instrument for labor force and economic development. But at the same time, it is an important mechanism for social inclusion. We have an emerging social order founded on the knowledge-based economy, which accordingly presents a new and challenging social policy paradigm. Across the world, countries and citizens are taking steps to build and participate in the growing knowledge economy. Low-skilled jobs are disappearing, being replaced with smart systems or outsourced to less developed countries. Drivers of information-era growth and competitiveness are now linked to long-standing social priorities like education and having a more skilled workforce. Regions are being propelled to the economic forefront in the knowledge-based economy. As a result, universities, research and development labs, and health research centers are quickly becoming the important drivers of the economy. Increasingly, businesses and jobs will cluster where the talent is located, rather than simply where resources and jobs are. So investing in the development of citizens, which is the social capital, through educational attainment is key to ensuring both social cohesion and economic competitiveness. Now more than ever, higher levels of education are linked to improved employment prospects. Stats Canada reported in 2013 that the employment rate for adults aged 25 to 64 who did not graduate from high school was 55%, while it was 82% for college and university grads. So the bottom line is that there's now an ongoing need for knowledge workers to upgrade and upskill within this global economy, and in general, we need to create as many economic opportunities for as many people as possible. And I'm going to give some examples in my 5 to 6 minutes. I'd like to talk for a few points on economic development through knowledge mobilization. And this is about public and private research investments being made both at the knowledge and on the product side at our institutions. At our institutions, there is an array of leading-edge, pure and applied research going on, much of it fueled by our resource-based industries. Moreover, focusing research on the needs of the local community and region is also occurring. For example, universities and the colleges' commitment to the North. Recently, the 2 presidents from U of R and U of S both made visits to La Ronge and the surrounding communities to talk about what both universities can do for the North and the opportunities for partnership. They're talking about offering courses and programs so that people can learn where they live. Regional colleges, we've got 7 of them in the province, they've been partnering with regional businesses from mining to environmental firms. The U of R recently had their announcement. They developed world-renowned expertise on carbon capture and storage. This has led to partnerships with SaskTel and Hitachi. University of Saskatchewan has become a life and science crop research center. If you think back about where the world would be or what we would have done if we didn't have some of the work that went on with AgCan and the U of S in the terms of development of canola, the development of the various winter wheats, it'd be quite a bit different, I think, at the university. The mobilization of knowledge in the knowledge economy requires opportunities for ideas and inventions, which is both pure and applied, to be implemented. When I think about inventions and I think about innovation, and I look about some of the researchers that I would have had contact with when I was going to school, I think it's all about curiosity. A good research, good invention requires the curiosity and requires people to be able to have a dream. I think one of the important roles at the universities or at the post-secondary institutions is creating opportunity for people to dream and to be able to invent, because that's where innovations occur. But innovation not only occurs in the science, it also really is a combination of science, engineering, arts, and business, because you have to be able to have these innovations to occur with a blending of all these themes. The vision of the social and business entrepreneur must be linked to the discovery of the researcher and scientist. And this way, when you link both the researcher and the scientist and the social scientist, you can get new ideas, new talent being developed in many different ways. In the knowledge economy, institutions are being asked to teach a breadth of skills to students while also creating the space for social networks and interactions to occur. The other thing we're seeing at some of the at the universities is that they're putting a stronger focus on teamwork, persuasion, and entrepreneurship. And this is where you'll see an integration of liberal arts with technological literacy and an emphasis on the social intelligence that makes for creative collaboration and leadership. Richard Florida, who's a prof at the Rotman School at the University of Toronto, he said highly developed social skills are different from mere sociability. They include persuasion, social perceptiveness, the ability to bring the right people together on a project, the ability to help develop other people, and a keen sense of empathy. Social skills seems to grow ever more essential as local economies grow larger and more complex. So in this sense, knowledge-based economies are like brains. Their growth and development require the growth and development of an increasingly dense web of synaptic connections, which I can't pronounce today. So that means we need art students as well as engineers and science majors to make the web that forms a knowledge-based economy. It is imperative that our post-secondary institutions seek better ways of offering an educational experience to the individual student, which models the role of a knowledge worker of today in seeking knowledge and skill development throughout life. We really need to think of students, think of ourselves as lifelong learners. And it's important to be able to apply your knowledge while you're in school, but also to take that knowledge and use it for different jobs throughout your life. And one of the ways, which Kevin really talked about, getting that knowledge base is through co-op opportunities or internships. And I'll give an example that's happening at the U of R. From 2008 to 2013, the University of Regina had a 45% increase in co-op and internship placements. So this went from 632 to 837 students. The placements were in liberal arts, businesses, administration, engineering, and science. Although much of today's economic growth is being led by knowledge-based economic activity, this sector is not by itself independent of other sectors within the economy, such as the service or resource sectors. In general, more technological information and knowledge is required for most sectors of the economy, and workers need more training, which is beyond just high school education. We even have some of our technical institutions now providing training in the construction industry, everything from industry safety standards to specific skilled trades. So just thinking about when you go out from high school and you want to work in construction industry, even that requires more trades as that becomes more defined and also becomes, I think, a little bit more complex and harder. While we all recognize the value of post-secondary education, we still have a lot more work to do in Saskatchewan. We have been steadily increasing, but as Kevin pointed out, we lag behind the rest of the country in a number of ways in the rest of the OECD countries. But we also lag in our population who have completed post-secondary education. Just 48% of our population in Saskatchewan have done so, compared to 54% nationally. Likewise, we need to empower greater numbers of First Nations and Métis students to succeed. Just 35% of Aboriginal people in Saskatchewan have completed post-secondary education. In the province, in the next 5 years, 9 out of 10 employment opportunities will require a minimum of a high school diploma, and the vast majority will require at least a post-secondary certificate or apprenticeship training. There'll be the next 5 years in Saskatchewan, there'll be 95 job opportunities, which need to be filled by a transforming student demographic. Our enrollment continues to grow annually with a learner population that has increased by about 7% since 2008. This includes a 3% increase in First Nations and Métis students. So the challenge is, how will our post-secondary system engage First Nation and Métis students to a greater degree so that they can succeed and provide meaningful connections to our labor market? With increasing participation rates, immigration to Saskatchewan and international recruitment have helped to offset local demographic trends. It remains unclear, though, how long this trend will increase. Both our institutions, U of S, U of R, and SIAS, and some of our regional colleges have seen increases in international students. And as we've seen in Kevin's statistics, there is lots of competition from Australia, from the other countries, including the US. So we have to develop our own niches, and we have to also be able to attract international students here for certain types of experiences. Our institutions will also have to continue to focus on non-traditional age groups, lifelong learners, and in international students. They are also going to further adapt to ways students learn as a result of new technology. And Kevin started to talk a little bit about MOOCs, and also about the way we call you do reverse learning. You learn your, when a prof would teach you, learn the lesson outside the class, and then the inside of the class is really used to have discussions, to do group work. So I call it, in some ways, it's the reverse way of learning. But I think the technology will change, and we're only at the start of where we're going to see how students will learn and how we will learn in the future. In closing, as we continue to take advantage of the benefits of a knowledge-based economy, we also have to take the responsibility to ensure that everyone is given the opportunity to succeed. I'll leave you with two thoughts from Peter Drucker, who coined the term knowledge economy. Two things he said. First, the knowledge society is a society in which many more people than ever can be successful. The second thing he said, we can now accept the fact that learning is a lifelong process of keeping abreast of change, and the most pressing task that we have is to teach people how to learn. Thank you.
It's always hard to follow Kevin, but it's great to reunite with him, because as Dale mentioned, I had the good fortune to work with Kevin for a couple of years, some 10 years ago, when he was Deputy Minister of Finance. And it was always fun then to brainstorm some of the challenges and opportunities of our country. But I have to tell you, then as now, Kevin was always several steps ahead of me. I don't really have much of a claim as a futurist. In fact, I think if I'd been alive in 1899, and if I hadn't had, some may think I was alive in 1899, if I had not been alive in 1899, and if I had not had the benefit of whoever was doing the Kevin Lynch Act then, I would probably have agreed with the Commissioner of the U.S. Patent Office, one Charles Duell, strange that he would say this, who said, everything that can be invented has been invented. But lack of knowledge or expertise has never deterred me before, so here I go. The closest I ever came, I think, to peering into the future was back in 1998, when, as Dale mentioned, I chaired something called the Task Force on the Future of the Canadian Financial Services Sector. The name was a heck of a mouthful, and so was our agenda. We had looked at bank merger policy, consumer protection, regulatory structure, you name it. But we had to do that in a context. We had to try to be a bit of a futurist and look ahead and see what we thought was going on and might impact our banks and insurance companies. And our report touched on three items as we then identified them: globalization, technology, demographics. So 16 years ago, the music had already begun. The trends were probably less evident than Kevin has pointed out, and the implications for the country were probably hazier. But it was already clear, for instance, in the financial sector, which I was looking at, that they were front and center and would remain so at a time of really warp-like speed. I'd like to use my time by chatting about one other matter that either deserves to be a nuancing factor or might even be viewed as its own separate megatrend. In fact, if you look at Kevin's slide on risk management, 4 of the top global risks identified there deal with this particular item. Now, I'll use these hot 2 words first because they're words that in good company you don't use. Climate change. Climate change. Now, climate change is really the third rail of electoral politics and policy making around the world. I'm really not concerned in these remarks as to whether or the extent to which man is causing the phenomenon. What I think is important to realize as we look ahead and devise our policies against the backdrop of what Kevin has described is that we are seeing quite massive changes in global climate, including many more catastrophic weather events than has been the norm. There are lots of publications out there by people who know because they have their skin in the game, people like Munich Reinsurance, Allianz, others, who have identified that the claims experience in the reinsurance market, for instance, over the last 10 or 15 years has essentially doubled, so that the payouts are really twice what they've been before. And we have to realize that that's likely to continue. And the ripple effects of this for national economies may well be hugely significant factors. I came across, as I was thinking about this, a report that Standard & Poor's issued in May of this year, which they entitled Climate Change is a Global Megatrend for Sovereign Risk. Now, I do hesitate, Kevin, to use Standard & Poor's as an authoritative source, given that they were among the organizations that rated the dodgy securities you've already talked about, gave them AAA ratings before they almost blew up the global financial system. That said, it is the ongoing task of rating agencies such as Standard & Poor's to peer into the future and to develop hypotheses about it as they consider the credit ratings that they're going to ascribe to national governments and corporations. They are really supposed to be professional futurists. In that May report, Standard & Poor's concluded that there were 2 megatrends that have emerged, they said, which should dominate public discussion and public policy attention in assessing global economic risks. The first, they said, was global aging. Kevin's spoken about that. The second, climate change, they said, is hazier, with potential economies and outcomes, with the impact of the potential outcomes being much more challenging to predict. However, everyone in this room can relate to visions of clogged streets in major Asian cities, parched California fields, dried up watercourses, possible food insecurity, social unrest, and the fallout. In its analysis, Standard & Poor's assessed the potential impact of climate change on the economic growth prospects and the fiscal capacity of 116 countries. While cautioning that there was a great deal of uncertainty about if, how, and when various economies would be affected, they concluded that the emerging economies, which are the winners on many of the other scales of the megatrends that Kevin talked about, were far more likely to be negatively affected than the developed economies. To give you a bit of a feel for it, of those 116 countries that were assessed through the various lenses that Standard & Poor's put upon them, Luxembourg, no coastline, no agriculture, fairly well-developed governance structures, was said likely to be the least impacted. While at the other end, 116, was Cambodia. I think what's interesting is that China was number 82, India was number 101, both negative outliers. So what are we to make of this analysis for purposes of this discussion and others like it? Simply this, I think, that as we think about the leg up which these emerging economies appear to have, as these megatrends are unfolding, they too may encounter some pretty big speed bumps in the future. Policymakers in the West, I think, can be tempted to rely too much on visions of inevitable future growth in the emerging markets. Not all of our policy eggs should be in that basket. Much closer to home, The threat of significant climate change raises further policy issues as we assess what's happening in the energy world, which is near and dear to us. How big a policy bet should we make on a future carbon-based global energy economy? How long into the future? Kevin correctly says, for the foreseeable future, it probably is the world. And how do we factor climate change risk, if at all, into those policies? I want to say a final word on an unrelated topic, but occurred to me as I watched one of Kevin's last slides. It's interesting to note that as he reviewed the various competitiveness factors, Canada has a high rating in respect of the livability of our cities. Some observers point to urbanization as another global megatrend freestanding on its own. Whatever the truth of that, it does seem to be clear that livable cities with great infrastructure, good educational and cultural facilities will be well positioned for success in that global economy of the future. We do have a competitive advantage here, and the trick for us, I think, is to figure out what our policy response is to try to build on that strength and to reap the economic rewards which should flow from that particular reality. I'm looking forward to chatting further with all of you and Kevin as the discussion goes forward. Thanks.
I do want to start from a little different perspective. Rather than talking about an actual individual trend, I want to take a page out of the Big Bang Theory, okay? I tend to watch that every once in a while with my 3 children. It's an interesting program. It in a sense, kind of stylizes the way the world is looked at. There's a gentleman in the program, Sheldon. You may know who Sheldon is, okay? And Sheldon likes to argue with everybody else that physics is the only issue in the world, okay? It subsumes everything else. It's his girlfriend's area of study, okay, kind of falls under it. The other characters in the program fall under it. And I'm going to advance a similar theory. There's really only one trend, I believe, that is key. If you're going to set them up in a hierarchy, okay, it's technology. That is your key trend. It is the one that dictates what's going on in most of the other areas. And I think if you have a look at Kevin's presentation, you'll see that to a large extent. Now, technology has always been important, whether it's the creation of the wheel, or whether it's the invention of the computer, internal combustion engine. You can look at a lot of different technologies that came along, and they had a certain impact on a certain part of the world, maybe. And maybe it took 70 years for it to expand out to other parts of the world. But there's been such a change in the types of technology that are coming to us. It's the pace of technological change right now that really is the challenge. Or maybe it is the opportunity to solve some of the other problems that we may have. Now, I'm going to try to put this a bit into a context and give you a bit of a sense of things I've seen here in Saskatchewan that really sort of play to that particular theory. And I'll first start, SaskTel, I've been there for 4 years, so I've had to learn a fair bit about the technologies, what the history was, and how it's changed. And so I want to start with wireless networks. So the first wireless network we put up here in Saskatchewan was something called Analog back in 1989. This was the old bag phones you may have heard, or may have seen, okay, where there were bricks. Sometimes we call them bricks, okay, that you put up to the side of your head, and the battery was, again, as large as a brick, essentially. Now, that particular technology lasted for quite a while, but in the early 1990s, another technology came on the scene called CDMA. It's the flip phones, the StarTex, BlackBerry. A lot of those came out at the same point in time. Now, that was about 20 years for those two technologies to come out. And then in 2010, a new technology came out called 4G. That particular technology revolutionized everything. Now you could use your phone to move data. That is the way you can go mobile internet. The old BlackBerries, where they allowed you to do email and things like that, there was no internet connection. Now, this was a brand new technology, but in 3 years, essentially it's become obsolete. We're still using it, but now the new technology is something called LTE. Well, behind LTE, there's LTE Advanced, there's VoLTE, there's a series of new technologies, something called 5G, that are on the horizon. And it's the speed of change of technology now that's creating the kind of challenges that we have. But the other aspect of technology that's different than what it was years ago is the pervasive nature of it. One of my favorite stories, we do a little work overseas, SaskTel this, through a company called SaskTel International. And I love to tell a story about one of my staff over in Tanzania. At one point in time, we ran the Tanzanian phone company. And my staff member talks about going out to the Serengeti Plain, and they run into tribesmen. I think it's the Maasai, if I remember correctly, that's out on the Serengeti Plain. And as they sit and talk to the tribes people, and they asked them about their traditional life and the huts that they had, etc., one of the tribesmen reached into his attire, what you'd see in a National Geographic. And what did he pull out? He pulled out a CDMA phone. What was he doing with the phone? Well, he was actually transferring money to his wife that was in one of the local communities. So technology now, it doesn't just change a country, it doesn't change the OECD countries, it changes the world. It's more pervasive, it's faster moving than anybody in the world, I think, hasn't expected to believe or expected to believe in the past. As another example of this, Netflix was only started about 6 years ago. It was started in Florida. It is now the largest over-the-top online content service in the world. And that's in a period of 6 years. Do you remember Blockbuster? If you're, I don't know, I'll be careful about the age, but if you're younger than a certain age, you won't even remember Blockbuster. It was a flash in the pan, in a sense. Technology overtook it. So I would subscribe that it's the pace of change that really is changing the world for us right now, the pace of technology change. Now, I want to relate it back a little bit to the 5 of the trends that were in Kevin's presentation. I want to talk a little bit about the whole issue of supply and demand in the energy sector. And Kevin talked a little bit about what's happening in that particular sector. But it's important to think about the impact of the change. We know things about fracking, we know things about fracking and what's happening there. There's horizontal drilling. A completely new technology came out of the West here, and that's opening up whole new areas of reserves. But to give you a sense of the impact, through several processes of recovery, you can get up to 35 to 40% out of a particular set of reserves, out of a particular oil field or a gas field. Now that's after you do something like water flood or whatever else, okay? If you are able to implement a technology that simply adds another 10% to the recoverable reserves, moves it from 35 to 40%, you're in a sense adding 22, 23, 24% to the overall supply of oil or natural gas in the world. Sort of very incremental change, if it's revolutionary and it's technology driven, actually expands the supply in a pretty major way. You know, you can look at something like our aging population as well. Why is our population aging? Well, it's largely because of medical technologies. CRTs, CAT scans, all of these technologies allow for more rapid diagnosis. They allow for the type of medical imaging that allows for surgery to be much more non-invasive. There are issues around infection rates, for instance, okay, that play into survivability in the hospitals. You know, you can talk about this from an educational perspective. And again, both Kevin, both speakers have really talked a lot about how education is changing. But I want to go back to the people now that are joining into the educational system. There's how you facilitate education, but there's the expectation of the people that are going to school in the future. At one point, when I went to school, there definitely wasn't such a thing as a computer. You did not have an iPad on your desk. You did not have a cell phone. And in fact, a cell phone today with a quad processor probably has more processing power than most of the computer systems in major companies 25 years ago. But what's changed is the individuals that go to university now, that go to high school, that go to public school, have a different approach to learning. They've learned through the internet. They've learned through interaction. It's completely different than what it was previously. So whether the education area wants to change or not is almost a moot point. They have to change. And they have to change because of Google. They have to change because of Apple, IBM, and the companies that are bringing these new products to the world as we speak. So the final area I think I want to touch on, just to give you sort of one more example of how technology has been the driving force in almost all of these areas, is simply the amount of new information or knowledge. Now, in the telecom industry, movement of data is king. When it comes to something like voice, it's a dying industry essentially. Telephones are, as most people in the room would admit, there's cord cutting. It's simply not going to be an area of key business in the future. But moving data has become essential. And why has moving data become essential? Because the amount of data, the knowledge of the world is doubling every 5 years right now. Now, it could be debatable whether or not it's true knowledge. It's maybe more data in a sense. But your ability to be able to absorb that is much more limited. You need to use different tools. You need to use different approaches. And again, it's technology that is supplying the kind of responses and the kind of answers that are necessary to be able to manage that as we go forward. So in conclusion, I want to submit that the first and most important trend that Canadians are going to need to address is quite simply the advancement and application of technology. It is what is the driver to change that's going on right now in Canada, but in addition, it's likely the solution to a lot of the problems that we have in Canada. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, listen, on behalf of everybody here, I want to thank Kevin, Louise, Harold, and Ron for this afternoon. So join with me in thanking them. And I know that they have very busy schedules. For them carving this time out to do this is very, very much appreciated. I know, Kevin, you made a special effort to get out here, and you're traveling constantly, so it's very much appreciated. And so on behalf of the Johnson-Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest.